Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you're watching us. My name is Carolina, and I am here representing the Systems Change Alliance. We are a non-profit organization that firmly believes in the power of the arts and creative work to make people think about important issues, also spread messages about change and alternatives to the mainstream ways of doing things. Here with us today, we have a best-selling author, Erikson, who is also an archaeologist. He is mostly known for the best-selling series Malazan Book of the Fallen, but he has also published over 20 books and been nominated for multiple awards. His work touches on several important topics such as privilege, power hierarchies, and rise and fall of civilizations. Welcome, Stephen, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this.
Me too. I'm going to kick this off with a question that you must have been asked already hundreds of times, but it is, what inspired you to become a writer, and in particular, a fantasy writer, to tackle, and with such all-encompassing work, spanning 10 books, and what inspired you to do this?
That's a hard question. I think I initially thought I was going to be a comic book artist, and so I was taking courses in art classes and stuff with the Winnipeg Art Gallery, living in Winnipeg, but back then this was before any kind of electronic capacity for producing comic books. I mean, things are so much easier now. So back then you would have to sort of pencil in everything, ink it all, and then paint it, color it, do all the layout, everything. And it was so time consuming that it would take me a week to get one page done, one panel. So eventually, I guess the art dropped, the illustrations dropped away, but the narrative stayed there. And so I guess I defaulted back to something that was a lot easier. All I needed was a typewriter, and fortunately an electric typewriter that had a correct tape on it, so I could at least have clean manuscripts. But in terms of why fantasy, well, I grew up reading fantasy, and I suspect I grew up reading fantasy. My upbringing was, a fairly impoverished family, and so there were always stresses in the household, and there were always sort of those kind of situations where a young boy would want to escape in some fashion or another. And so I think I was drawn to those sort of other world experiences of these writers talking and writing about other planets and fantasy worlds, secondary worlds, which I didn't really think of them as secondary worlds at the time, but that's what they were. And that's just sort of where I was sort of pulled in, and my imagination was set on fire. I guess that's probably, the best answer I can come up with in terms of inspiration.
Okay. Thank you for sharing something that's so personal.
Well, it may seem personal, but it's when I reach the age now where I can look back and I can sort of have some objectivity on these things, and those kind of stresses, when you talk to other writers, other artists, so many of them have come from dysfunctional backgrounds in some fashion or another. And I don't know, maybe the creative impulse is, it has to be stung to life or whatever. I don't know if that's entirely true. I don't think you need to have gone through hell in order to become an artist, but there does, at least for me personally, seem to be an element to which what I went through has fed the kind of art that I produce. And I don't think there's any way around that. I think that's natural for everyone.
Well, this was a question that I hadn't planned for so soon in the interview, but it seems to make sense now. and I'm going to pick on an essay that you wrote, which was the problem of Karsa Orlong,
Oh, yes.
where you mentioned the escapist role of fantasy. And I would like to get your thoughts on what you think about the rise in popularity of fantasy in recent years, because I'm still pretty young and I still remember that when I was in high school, fantasy and sci-fi were still, and superheroes are quite niche and things of the nerds. And in recent years, it has been a burst of just Marvel and the popularity, Game of Thrones. These are just a couple of examples. Does this make you worried about the state of the world?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm naturally worried about the state of the world, but I think it was interesting to see how nerds became cool and geeks became cool. And then once that happened, it did not take long before those subcultures became mainstream. And, the money then starts pouring in. And then you think of the budgets of all the Marvel comic films, they're through the roof. When I was much younger, if there was a Comic-Con, and they didn't even call it a Comic-Con back then, but a comics convention, it would be in one of the back rooms of the convention hall with 300 people going through stacks of comics, and that was it. And of course, Comic-Cons now are big business, and major production companies put a lot of money into Comic-Cons. So the money has arrived in a sense, and that is sort of, it drags the whole subgenres onto the middle of the stage. But I do find it personally ironic that, yes, if I was escaping reality by reading fantasy, that I would then write fantasy that said, oh no, you cannot escape reality. It seems a bit ironic in that respect.
Yeah. Okay, so you say, well, this makes sense with my next question, which is about worldviews. And we do know that our cultures and worldviews in the real world are based on narratives that we have been building for thousands of years. And I would like to know, how do you believe in the power of fiction writers to actually shape worldviews that impact the way that people think about the world?
First of all, I don't know to the extent that we are efficacious in shaping worldviews. I think there are other factors at work in terms of whatever a status quo system of checks and controls and power exists within a culture or a civilization. There are many other factors at work that keep everyone from just sort of looking up and looking around and saying, this is completely messed up, and doing something about it. So I think on a personal level, we are very much encouraged to continue to walk the same paths that civilization has been walking for the last 200 years. And that is an immense pressure on an individual. It's very, very difficult to fight against that tide. And it doesn't matter if you're a millionaire or somebody on welfare. I mean, that tide is still pushing, and it's still dragging all of us along. It seems to have its own impetus, its own momentum. So am I convinced that art actually has any efficacy in shaping worldviews? I waver. I'm back and forth on that a lot. And it certainly was not my purpose when I sat down to write my books. Entertainment, I think, has to be a large element to what drives somebody forward. And since the Malazan world was co-created, it was myself and another writer and archaeologist, we basically were role-playing this world, and we used the world in some ways, probably not consciously, not until later, but we used the world to engage in a conversation between us. And it was a conversation about culture, civilization, cultures in contact, cultures in transition, um, about the role of history, uh, about the notion of origin myths when it comes to countries, peoples, cultures, um, and where in those origin myths can kernels of truth be found. And as archaeologists, of course, that's where we go looking anyways, looking for the material evidence anyways. And historically, archaeologists have gone into the myths and gone into the legends and found things, whether it's Mycenae or Troy or whatever. So yeah, that was kind of the world that we were sort of immersed in as archaeologists. And so it didn't seem too much of a reach that if we were going to be creating a fantasy world, that we would let those same forces be at play, and then we would explore that and basically talk back and forth with our books.
How about, okay, let me put this in a different way. So how about languages, for example? It has been shown that they can modulate the neuron pathways in your brain, so you can really see differences between Eastern and Western languages. And even you don't even have to leave Europe. If you look at, my background is in a Romance language, and you can see the difference in age and things like the it word, that it, he, she, it doesn't exist in Portuguese, for example. So these are interesting differences that exist. And
oh yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, languages are cognitive shapers, definitely, and that certainly affects our worldview on a personal level. Yeah.
Exactly. So how about the power? Because personally, and for those of you who may not be watching, who may be watching and may not actually have read Malazan Book of the Fallen, starting to read, pick up the first book would be something like a portal opening up in your living room, and you're sucked into it, and you fall into this battlefield where there's things exploding around you, and you cannot maybe understand 10% of the words. What does this even mean? And it's really like being sucked into a different world, and you have to sort of follow along and try to figure out what's happening. And reading this at an early stage in my life, I think that it may actually have helped to how comfortable I am with having to pierce out a body of knowledge that I'm not comfortable with. I think that it may have played a role. Do you think that fiction in this sense could play a role in maybe not large scale, but what about at the individual level?
Yeah, and well, okay. First of all, I cannot speak for others. So if there are going to be testimonies, there will be testimonies to that effect. But thinking personally, yes, definitely the works that I read, especially my formative periods, I guess, from age 12 to 20, something like that, were really quite profound in how they shaped my way of seeing things. And at the same time, one learns from other writers and other artists the craft of writing. And so, we call it learning to make it sound, nice and academic, but basically it's stealing things from other writers. A well-placed sentence, a well-structured sentence. I would take that sentence apart and try to figure out why it was working the way it was. And so that kind of impact, I think that's where sort of reading is at its most beneficial. Is that it really does shape, where we come from. And of course, what then happens is those formative texts that we read when we're all, teenagers or whatever, they become lifelong, passions in the sense of defending those things. And I know personally, I went back and started reading some of the first books I'd ever read, and some of them are really not very good. But I mean, the place they had in my heart remained intact. For all the flaws of say Edgar Rice Burroughs, there was something magical, and that magical is maybe nostalgic on my part, but that magic is the very thing that one wants to, as a writer, trigger in others in some fashion. And so that's what we end up working hard at, if we can.
Well, in that sense of nostalgia, you do talk a lot about the importance of compassion in your novels, and to say that I'm truly on board with that. And I would like to ask you, like, do you think that we can move towards a more compassionate world as a species? And I'm not sure if this question is confusing, but for example, I think that in Buddhism, you frequently talk about moving to compassion, but through understanding and deep listening. And in the world where we live now, where there is no time, the way that we see time is that we don't think that we can take the time to sit and just listen to what someone is saying deeply. So,
well,
I would think that, yeah, maybe changing the way that we look at time could help. So how do you think that we could do something towards moving for compassionate world?
I don't know if I have an answer to that one. One of the things that my understanding regarding, for example, the Buddhist example you've just given, is the listener needs to be in a internally safe and secure place. And that gives them the time to listen. That gives them the freedom to disengage whatever emotional investment they've got in that moment, and to just sit back and listen. And in the case of novels, and especially big fat novels like the ones I'm writing, I'm trying to sort of slow the reader down. And there's always a risk, of course, is that if you slow the pace down too much, you lose the reader. They get bored, etc. And this can happen. But by sort of layering the language with as much subtext and complexity as it can withstand, is an effort on my part to just say, just slow this down, pay attention. There are other things going on here that will play into later on in the series. But in terms of compassion, I guess if I have any issues regarding the Buddhist approach is, what do you do once you've listened? Do you stay passive? Do you stay inactive? Is the value of listening to be found exclusively within that moment? And what goes beyond that? What goes past that? When I hear of striving to reach periods of bliss, personal bliss, spiritual bliss, I get nervous because I think for myself, I would never want to reach that place. Because if I did, I probably wouldn't write another word. Because the impulse to write is all about forces, internal forces that are driving you, and a kind of angst or a kind of existential anxiety that is pushing you forward. So yeah, if I was completely blissed out with the world, I wouldn't be writing anything, and I'd go live in a cave, So, and I don't see the value of that. It may be personally rewarding, but there has to be something beyond that, at least for me. And that comes back to my idea, at least, that it is community that actually matters more than anything else. Acknowledging that no community is utterly united in all aspects of its belief systems. But at least it is an acknowledgement of the necessities of our species, that we need to exist in community. And, with COVID having triggered this isolation globally, we're seeing the psychological effect of that. and it's pretty profound. Once you isolate us, each of us, things get a bit squirrely, things get a bit strange. So yeah, I guess compassion is, people need to be, and I'm speaking personally, I need to be dragged into a place where compassion is possible, because we resist, and we resist out of self-protection more than anything else, I think. Because to be compassionate is to be very, very vulnerable. And we're not in a society that is in any way respectful of that or rewarding of it. So it's a tough battle. I mean, the co-creation of the Malazan secondary fantasy world placed magic quite central in the world building, and it made the magic egalitarian because we wanted to remove any kind of gender-based hierarchy of power. So the Malazan world is a world without sexism, and the cultures that evolved within it have not incorporated any of that language and any of that worldview. But that simply had to be the backdrop to the stories we were telling. We were not interested in waving a flag on this one. It was just going to exist. And it, in a sense, it became a kind of a fictional experiment. Is that, where would this take us in terms of storytelling?
It is so amazing that you picked that up, because that was my next question.
Okay.
I was going to ask, so in Malazan world, particularly in the army, you see that you meet a character and the name will be kind of funny, like Jan Tovis, what is that? So, and then you will later learn the gender or the sexual orientation or the color of the character's skin.
Yeah.
Do you think that this is achievable? And I will raise the bar on this question. If you could advise your government, so let's say the Canadian government, give them some advice on how to achieve a worldview like this, what would you tell them?
Exercise and practice decency. It is all down to decency. The treatment right now of the Native peoples in Canada is deplorable. The treatment of the environment here in British Columbia is just jaw-droppingly awful. And so this notion of, I mean, it sounds simple, but obviously it seems to be unattainable, that notion of decency. We're so quick to judge, so quick to sort of define our camp and then patrol its borders. But to step away from the Malazan series, I mean, this was a lot of what I was exploring in the First Contact novel, Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart, was just that notion of just decency. And it was very curious that the response to it was very divisive. People saw that as actually being, pinko, communist, whatever, right? And it always struck me that, at what point did decency become a political position? But it seems to have, and that's it's not a good place for us to be. I think we need to sort of step away from that. So that would be the advice I would give, but it will fall on deaf ears, and that's just the way it is.
Okay, so at this point, I would like to tell the audience that in a little bit we'll be opening up for questions. So if you'd like to start putting them in the comments, we're going to read through them and choose a few for Stephen to answer. So please feel free. Oh, and so now this question is a little bit different. So in this year, you are finally releasing the first volume of the long-awaited Witness trilogy. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, since you normally cover important topics and several of them in the novels, was there any specific topic that really inspired you, or that was really alive for you when writing this one?
Yeah, I can go straight to my answer on that one. I don't have to dance around. I asked myself before I started the novel, what is the role of a soldier? And then I set about exploring that. And of course, the immediate answer would be, protect your nation, fight wars, et cetera, et cetera. But I wanted to go a little bit past that and explore the notion of um, acting in service to something greater than oneself. And so that is what this first novel is certainly exploring.
Okay. And do you think that your novel will be polarizing, since you just mentioned that Rejoice
Yeah, I can't.
unexpectedly was?
Yeah, I cannot predict these things. I've long since given up trying to figure out whether something's going to be successful or not, or divisive or not. Quite often the divisiveness, really catches me off guard. I never saw Rejoice: A Knife to the Heart as a political novel, and yet that's how it's taken, and I just had no idea that would happen. But so no, I cannot predict the response.
How about, so a little interesting thing that you keep mentioning is that action to something greater than yourself, and which is very visible in your novels. And yeah, I know that I've mentioned Buddhist philosophy, but it is also curious because you talked about inaction, and there are so many different schools of thought there.
There are.
Yes, and I actually thought that maybe the notion of ascendancy in your novels would have been based on it, because you ascend, you sort of become a god through outstanding action. And there are Buddhist schools that do say that once you get to eliminating the bad karma, you will sort of ascend to a different state, and that this is all based on action, selfless action. You are not acting for yourself.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing that it's not based on that.
It's partly based on that. It's it might actually be more based, and this sounds really prosaic, but it might be more based on the mechanical structure of role-playing games where a character levels up. That probably has I'm really trying to make sure that the implication isn't that it's really sort of profound philosophical thinking behind the ascendancy aspects of the novels. There's no doubt that both Eslamont and I, being anthropology students, we absorbed a lot of writing and thinking on the formation and creation of belief systems, religions, faiths. And that all sort of, it found some kind of expression in the Malazan world, in the world building that we did. But a few times, I think, ascendancy happens simply because somebody is in a particular place at a particular time. So these things, these are forces, I guess, beyond their sense of, sorry, bald eagle just flew by. So there are forces beyond, beyond sort of one's individual will that can act upon an individual. And then the question then is, well, what do they do with it? And I think we explored that a fair bit, the idea of, even if you have ascendancy, there's no moral compass to it. In other words, if someone is handed power, there's no intrinsic rule book on how that power is used. And so then it defaults back to the personality and what shaped that person in terms of what they do with the power that they are given. And that's kind of the whole thing in a nutshell, I think, in terms of ascendancy. Because as you said, there are other schools of Buddhist thought that would put you in the cave, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the questions are really coming in, so I guess that this is seems like the right time.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything. Is this supposed to be something on my screen, or there will be? Or?
No, they're coming in on Facebook,
Oh,
and
I
I'm
see.
gonna read some of them out.
Okay.
So a really interesting one here is, what is the starting point? It's from Christos. What is the starting point of your world building? Creating maps, cultures, traditions, and history, or creating characters, their background, and from there you scaffold the entire world?
Looking back on it, it was creating maps. And I think it's because as archaeologists, especially when you're doing a survey or an excavation, when you show up at the lab to get your equipment together before you head out, the first thing you look at are maps. And you read elevations and you look at landscape and all of those things that sort of help guide an archaeologist to find the sites that they're looking for, if they don't already know where they are, or to explain why those sites are where they are. And so I think maps were very sort of formative for the world building. We always needed, a kind of a reasonable, realistic setting for what we're going to, do with our story, because the story involves gods and magic and all the rest, which in of itself is not realistic. So the more realistic the environment in which we set those adventures and those stories, the more likely it would be that you can kind of buy the story, you can actually accept it. We need those details. And that's sort of where we started. And I think then we just you roll up the characters, so you drop the characters in, and then you go from there. But maps and landscape were huge.
Okay, so there is a question from a writer, from a viewer with name in Russian script, so sorry, I cannot say your name. So what would you say to writers, particularly fantasy writers that are just starting out? What helped you get going?
I would say this to all writers: whatever you start, finish it. Finish what you start. I remember this really early on when I was first learning sort of the craft of writing. There was so much energy and excitement in starting something, but then the pressure starts building after each choice you make, each detail you put in the creation of your setting and your world closes the door to some other alternatives. And so your pathway ahead starts to narrow with every page of writing that you do in a story. And because of that, it gets harder. And so quite often early on, the tendency is, when it really starts getting hard, is to just discard and start something new again, something different. And because that kind of energy is very addictive, and it's that moment of inspiration that makes you call up the blank screen and start typing. And there's a lot of adrenaline involved in that. There's a lot of excitement in that as you're creating on the screen. But the real work and the real learning comes when everything is stalled and everything is slowing to a crawl, and you're starting to, what I used to describe as sweating blood on the keyboard, because that's where you learn that you've set up all these elements of a story, and the challenge now is what to do with them, and what do you do to make it all meaningful in some way to an audience, to a readership. In terms of fantasy, in terms of starting up a fantasy, Uh, oof. One thing would be to take a look around and see what are the underlying assumptions of our world. How many of them have been kind of accepted in a general sense as being almost laws of nature? And if you look at the Western world, for sure, patriarchy is one of those things. It's almost given that, you know, there's almost a biological imperative that you know has created patriarchy, and there is really no evidence for that whatsoever. Patriarchy is a cultural manifestation. It's a cultural creation. Um, because we're sentient beings, we're not, you know, we're not hyenas. You know, there's a big difference there. And so if you examine those things, then it can often give you a bit of inspiration in terms of, well, you know, when I'm creating this fantasy world, what can I change? What can I change that while keeping those elements that make it seem human, and those elements of the human condition, maintaining those. And you don't even need human beings for that. You can use rabbits. I mean, it's been done. But in keeping all those things, what are the things that you're actually free to discard? And this is the great thing with fantasy as a genre. You can discard anything. And, you know, contemporary fiction, no, not really. Science fiction to some extent, but not to the extent of fantasy. And, you know, it is the foundational literature of our species. And so it's got a long history. It's got a long list of credentials. It's on, you know, it's got deep roots, and so you can do a lot with it. You won't break the branch, put it that way.
Okay, so the next question, I'm personally very curious about this as well, from Ben. How many languages do you speak or know, including ancient ones, and which, if you would like to share?
Yeah, I can barely speak one, really. I'm first generation Canadian. My parents are Swedish. When they moved to Canada, for whatever reason, they said, no, we're not going to speak Swedish in the home. I wish they had. We did move back briefly when I was about 5, and I know now that if I go to Sweden, within, I guess, about 3 or 4 days, I start understanding. I sure as hell can't speak it. And then with French, same thing. I took it in school, but my relationship with school, especially, you know, in my young years, was not a good one. I resisted everything. I remember even in junior high and high school, if I was given a book and told I had to read it, it's the last book I would read. I'd read all these other books, right? And then I would just fake it for the tests because I listened in class and was able, I guess, to piece together plot and certain other elements of the story to get a fair idea of what that novel was about. And then just I would fake it. So, you know, a student of average grades, put it that way. Yeah, it's yeah, I don't know. I forgot the question. Anyways.
Okay. There is now a simpler question that I guess many people will be wondering is if this is from Jan Clifford. Do you have any more trilogies or series planned after The God Is Not Willing?
No. No, I'm not signed for anything more. I do have some books in mind, but most of them are standalone novels. And it could be a product of, you know, as you get older, you get slower, you know, as a writer. At least I do. And so to commit to a new trilogy could well raise false expectations among readers that I can finish that trilogy, because I may not be able to. So, you know, even the trilogies I'm working on now, I'm struggling to finish. So I do not want to sort of make a promise to the readers that I can't keep. And so that's why I suspect I'll probably be delivering and writing standalone books, I think, for a while.
Okay, another question that is also simple from Seth. When you can, what is the first public appearance you would like to make?
Public appearance.
Maybe not so simple.
I want to go back to France, actually. I want to go back. The tour that we did, I think we covered 12 cities in a month, was one of the most wonderful experiences that I've had. It was absolutely magical. I think, yeah, I think a return to France. Laha Editions is the publisher there, and they're releasing the books every 6 months, translations, and they're doing an amazing job. And I really fell in love with the country.
Okay, this one is about the writing process from Eric. How often do you reread your work while in the process?
Only if I have to. Literally, I've had to go back and reread Forge of Darkness and Dead House and Fall of Light, because there was a lot going on there linguistically that I have to sort of try to recapture, the rhythms and patterns and sentence structure and all that kind of stuff. It's a very stylized trilogy. So I had to literally force myself to go back and read them. As for the 10-book sequence, I've never reread it. I probably should, but it feels like, you know, when I have to go back and, you know, sort of do a bit of research and I'm reading parts of a chapter or whatever, two things happen to me. One is I'm occasionally intimidated. I don't know if I'm as good a writer now as I was then. Because there was a lot of fire burning behind the scenes. I can see it when I read those sections. I was really, I guess, creatively on fire. And, you know, that's 11 years and 10 books and 3.5 million words. Maybe parts of that fire burned out. And so I'm very leery about going back to stuff I've written, because that may well have been the peak or the prime of my writing abilities. So yeah, and it's been strange of late to be talking about, you know, books that I wrote 20 or 30 years ago, because it does feel like that was some other person who wrote that stuff. It certainly wasn't me.
Okay, a different one from Anton. Do you think the destiny motive is crucial to your storytelling? And are you always considering how it will play out with personal choice and the will of the characters?
Free will. Is that the question? Destiny, was that it? About destiny?
Yes. Destiny motive. Yeah.
Motif. That's a really, yeah. You see, if I was halfway through writing the series, so say 15 years ago, I would give you a very different answer than what I'm giving you now. And so I'm having to look back and think about the series and who I was when I was writing it, and trying to parse out who I am now and the differences between the two. All I can say is, on a personal level right now, I'm probably thinking my belief system probably is leaning closer towards notions of fate than or predeterminism even, than when I was 15, 20 years ago. So I don't know if that's really, those are some aspects in terms of personal belief systems that I don't know if this is, the venue for it, or if there is a venue for it. So I won't really get into that kind of stuff. But I think I have experienced over, all these years, a diminishment of certainty regarding any kind of notions of principles that seek to define the limits of the universe. It's the only way I'm going to put it. So I'm far less certain than I ever was before.
Okay. The next one is from Arlo. Do you think the Malazan books deserve their reputation for being difficult? And I'll add to it. And how do you feel about this reputation?
I don't think they are, in terms of actual content, they're not difficult. In terms of the way readers approach their fiction, may make it difficult. And by that, I mean, if you are approaching your fiction the same way you would consume television shows or films, it's going to be a bit of a shock. Yeah, because I'm basically asking a lot of the reader to come along on this journey, but to be aware that as you're traveling through the story, you are both consciously and unconsciously picking things up, and both of them will be important later. And it may be that that style of reading is kind of self-limiting. I don't know. It might be. There's really not much I can do about it. I mean, the thing's written. I'm not going to go back and edit. I'm not going to change anything. It's done.
Okay, there was a question that I now lost in the comments, but I think I remember it was about compassion, and it had to do with if you had specific literary influences to write about this topic, or if it stems from personal experience.
I would guess that's exclusively from personal experience. I can't think of other works, of art or literature that are specifically addressing compassion. I mean, you get it in various books, and it's quite often implicit in the author's stance on things, or the artist's stance on things. But yeah, I think that was generated just from the life I've lived, I guess. One of the things I was taught really early on, and when I was in the writing school, was the necessity for the writer, the author, to step into the shoes of any character in their story, and to actually live in their skin, and to see things from that particular point of view. And I think once you start doing that as an exercise, it comes back on you. It basically, if you do it, ruthlessly enough, it will dismantle your own belief systems. Your own worldview will suddenly find itself on shaky ground. And I always thought, when I started here in Victoria in the writing program, every story tore me to pieces because it ripped down my worldview. And I was relentless on doing that. And I don't know why, but I just had this need that, this fiction cannot simply be there to confirm all my prejudices. So what I'm writing actually has to challenge those prejudices. And And if I'm honest enough with the characters and stay with the characters long enough, they will do that job. And I just have to accept that. And so I guess this probably falls in line with that notion of diminishing certainty that I experienced through my life. Everything is down to point of view, and not just in fiction. It's down to point of view in this real world as well. And the only thing that fiction can do, unlike the real world, is it can encapsulate and put bookends on a particular aspect of the human condition. So it exists in order to give meaning, whereas maybe the rest of reality doesn't. So I guess it's about as best an answer as I can give. I have this sense I'm not giving answers to any of these questions, but anyways.
No, I think you are, and I think you're being pretty honest. So, I mean, isn't that the best answer that someone can get? Someone that's coming from your heart, from the top of your head.
Well, there's no
okay,
hair.
So the last. Okay, so probably the last question. This feels like a hard one. It's from Nicholas. And how do we reconcile the need for more decency and compassion to better the world when the world also weaponizes empathy?
Weaponizes empathy. I'd love to get an elaboration on what is meant by that. I think I get a sense. I don't know if I even have an answer to that, especially in present circumstances. It's difficult because one of the things that has developed in the last 20 years. I'll step back. I'll give an example. Back in high school, for me, so we're talking the 70s. If for whatever reason a news channel brought their cameras to our high school to interview somebody, that kid standing in front of that camera would look awkward, would look shaky, would look nervous. The response to that kind of attention back when I was growing up was almost unwelcome. And of course, what's happened is with the advent of electronic media and portable electronic media, everyone of at least generations that are younger than mine have a certain level of ease in front of an audience, an imagined audience, a fictitious audience, or a very real audience, depending on how many people are following and viewing them. That in turn puts pressure on that individual. And that pressure is to conform to certain ideologies and certain belief systems in keeping and in line with whatever their worldview happens to be. And so I suspect, and there's probably been studies on it, but I suspect that notion of audience, which is now ubiquitous, it's universal in younger generations, puts pressure on that generation and puts pressure on the individual to actually what we call now virtue signaling. Whatever that virtue may happen to be, there's an expectation there that these are the steps and these that one has to go through, and these are the statements one has to make, and these are the positions one has to take on this, that, or the other. And it's certainly an invitation to being disingenuous. because a lot of us are not prepared to really articulate our belief systems. And unless you find, of course, the right crowd. And that certainly exists. Subcultures are springing up all over the place. So it's not a pressure that I experienced growing up. And I don't know if this has been for the good or for ill, you know, in terms of the evolution and change of our culture. But that notion of everyone now potentially being in a camera's eye, whether you're on the street, somebody's phone held up, you know, across the street, in a cafe, you name it. That notion of being there for public viewing, there for public consumption, probably imposes a kind of subconscious but very terrible pressure. And you know, I look back at my high school, my shy high school days, when we were all, you know, nervous about any attention at all, almost fondly now, you know, as it was something that it gave us the freedom to just be whoever the hell we were, without being observed in that huge screen that is sort of global attention of the internet. And so you know, in that sense, I feel very I guess partly worried. You know, I don't know where it's going. I don't know to what extent that actually begins to shape social cultures. I remember I tried to coin a phrase that nobody picked up on. It was called the ethosphere. And the idea was it's that similar to zeitgeist, but more in keeping with the fact that it's not culturally defined. It's global, but it's partitioned across you know, multiple venues and multiple sources. So an ethosphere being a sort of collected unity of certain belief systems that then express themselves and reiterate themselves, and you know, circle around themselves rather endlessly electronically. And I think a lot of what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years is we're seeing a global clash of those ethospheres. And it plays out on an individual basis, and then it plays out on a much larger scale. It is somewhat worrying. I don't know where it's going. I don't know what's going to happen in that respect.
Okay, so just we are already on top of the hour. So, but this is an answer that maybe will inspire you for just to keeping up with traditions with the Systems Change Alliance interviews. We will end with one question that is, what are your top 3 changes that you think the world needs right now?
Oh boy, top 3 changes. Oh, top 3 changes. Geez, I don't know. I wish you'd prime me on this one. I would have thought about it for a little bit longer.
It can be just one if 3 is too much.
Changes in the world right now. I think maybe, no, I can't. Oh, man, you just stumped me on this one. You know, one of the things.
Sorry.
One of the things a fiction writer does is throw up those changes and just lay them out there, you know, say in a fantasy setting, and then watch it play out. I mean, in a practical sense, I'd love to see a global corporate tax rate so that no company is able to actually hide from being taxed. I think that would actually have fairly profound effects. because what seems to be happening is the pooling of wealth, and let's face it, the wealth is arbitrary. It's invented, but it exists and it has great power, is really creating an imbalance. And the risk of that kind of level of imbalance, at least historically, is collapse. And so, and quite often violent collapse. So in a practical sense, I guess that would be one response. Another would be a little bit more in keeping with the novel I just finished writing. A renewed recognition of what it means to serve in the military. You know, in the last few years, especially running up on the US election, you know, there was this push for putting the army into the streets when people were protesting. And that just, it struck me as so so dangerous and so misplaced. So that might be one thing. And then in addition to that, I guess, or related to it, would be the renewed recognition that a government exists to serve its citizens, not the other way around. And this is something that I've seen even in the span of my life. I've seen that disappear. I've seen that dwindle away, that notion of government as service to its citizens. More often, you know, even here in this province especially, our governments are in service to logging companies. And that's it, you know, it's as simple as that. And so even when they come in on an election promise of protecting old growth forests, they lie and they get away with it. And now the company is about to tear down 1,000-year-old trees. And that short-term thinking is just, it's just jaw-dropping and heartbreaking at the same time. So yeah, accountability in government would be really nice. You know, I'm not holding my breath, but.
Well, I will have to say that, yeah, despite being having a lot of people from non-profit world, this was one of the most concrete answers that we've ever gotten to this question.
Really?
Yes.
Well, it's funny because,
very interesting.
Yeah, I don't mind if we go a bit longer, but I sat on a panel in a conference, a convention in France, where it's a very interesting convention because it draws in academics and scientists as well as artists. And so I was alongside two employees from I guess it was the UN, and they were dealing with and trying to address the future of food supply planet-wide, and new advances in science and agro-technical aspects, and all those elements that sort of, you know, are pressing issues regarding feeding the planet. And they came up with really interesting things. They had some very interesting statistics about how they were going to be able to feed the planet, to feed humanity. And I think I was the last person to sort of say anything on the panel. And when it came up to me, it struck me that the elephant in the room is, it's not a question of how do we feed all these people. It's a question of how do we stop the population from continuing to expand, because it's very clear that if you provide the food for an organism, that organism will expand, right? If you're feeding the petri dish, the bacteria will grow and grow and grow and grow. And if you keep feeding, they'll keep growing. But given that it's a petri dish with a lid on it, it only has a finite amount of space to grow into. And when it reaches that certain point, you get a complete population crash. Now, can you actually extrapolate from there to talk about global situation? Well, probably. You know, we exist in a very fractal universe. as above, so below, or in this case, as below, so above. So to me, it struck me that, yeah, I get the reason for and the necessity for actually finding ways to feed all these people, but it's not addressing the problem. It's simply pushing it further into the future for the next generation to deal with. And the more of us there are, the worse it's going to get. So yeah, anyways, there you go.
Well, thank you so much for being here, for taking the time, and you've given all of us a lot of food for thought. And thank you also to everyone that was watching for a really nice interaction, as always.
Cool.
If you have already read some of Steven Erikson's books, you already know how good they are. If you haven't, please do go and read them, because it's worth it. Thank you so much for being here, and good evening to you and to everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.